other women is their birth date to try to establish some kind of age. You know, we can get back to that later if you want to. Or do you want to do it now?
Well, I can remember approximately.
Just say, if you could just generalize, were people mostly in their early 20s, like you would have been 24 then?
24?
Well, in 1970. No,
26.
Wrong, 26, right.
Right. Charlotte, Joan, and I were
Oh.
almost exactly the same age.
Yeah.
Right.
You would have been 26.
26.
Mm-hmm.
Alice and Linda were about 2 years older.
Mm-hmm.
Caroline Nickerson was about the same age.
As what?
Joan and me.
Mm-hmm. Who was the same age? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Caroline.
Caroline, okay. All right.
Judy and Anka, I think, were about a year younger.
Yeah.
About the same,
25, maybe.
Yeah.
So the average age was definitely 25?
25. Nancy was younger, and Julie Huff was younger, and I think Linda Clover was younger.
So the range went from 19 to 28.
Yes, but the range of people who really stuck in there was about 24 to 29.
Yeah. So, and the average age would have been about 25.
Yeah, 26.
26, excuse me, yeah. Well, I'm just trying to even it out between the 26s and the 28s, but that
Right.
obviously would not be 25. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's just go into the childhood part. And there was only one piece of data that I think that might be useful, and that was, do you know how old your parents were about when they had you? You were the firstborn.
Right. Let's see. My mother, well, they were born in 21 and 20, and I was born in 44.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So they were, 22.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You want to just talk about your parents a little bit in general, and particularly about the kind of relationship you had with your parents, the kind of advice they gave you, the kind of, I mean, this is very, gross, but the kind of values that you got from them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind?
Sorry, I have to think a minute.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Well, my father was very much working his way up in the company in Continental Can. He had not finished college and was very aware of that. He was working in personnel. And he was gone a lot of the time because he was in personnel and he was always off talking to people and trying to settle strikes and things like that. And my mother didn't work outside the house. And she missed him. She missed him terribly.
Yeah.
I remember a whole lot of the time with just the girls, all of us, my mother and my two sisters and myself, around the table, and Mother waiting for Dad to get home on Friday. And we moved around all the time.
Where were you born?
I was born in New Jersey.
Right.
While I was born, I lived in an apartment. And then when my sister, Jo, was born, we moved into a house in the next town. And then we moved, let's see, after kindergarten. After I was finished kindergarten, we moved to Pittsburgh. And I went to first grade in a very old school with outhouses. And I went to second grade in a brand new school, and by third grade the school was too big. So I went to another old school for third grade. And my sister Martha was born when we lived in Pittsburgh. We lived in two houses there. We moved one when we first moved in, and then we moved to another one.
How old were you when Martha Joe was born?
Let's see, Joe's 2.5 years younger than me, and Martha's 7 years younger than me. I would say that my parents are very close. All my friends, when I got older, always kidded about how they always kissed in the kitchen, which was fairly unusual among parents.
Mm-hmm.
I was always much closer to my father. I really didn't like my mother very much.
Mm-hmm. What kind of, do you remember from being young, like before going away to school, what kind of image you had of your mother as a mother, or any kind of feelings that you had about her as a sexual model, as a woman? Or about your father? I mean, did you ever wish you were a boy?
Yeah, because I wanted to hitchhike to California from the time I was about 3. My grandparents always went to California for the winters, and I always wanted to go there very much. I don't remember very much about role models from when I was very young.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't remember knowing anyone whose mother worked.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just sort of assumed that that's the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
I also didn't. My mother said it was unusual that my father had to travel so much, but it didn't seem that unusual to me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the primary experience really was moving around all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And having to pick up and move on. And by the time after, I think it's when we moved to Wilton, which I started 4th grade there. No, that's not true. I went to 4th grade in Harrison, New York, then moved to Wilton in 5th grade. And one of those 2 moves, I told my father I didn't want to move ever again. I was sick of it. I couldn't stand it picking up and going on all the time. I was smart in school. When I first moved to Harrison, about the first week I was there, I won a spelling bee and beat this red-headed boy who was supposed to be the brightest person in the class.
Mm-hmm.
And I read books a lot.
Mm-hmm.
My mother always called me a bookworm.
Mm-hmm. And
I think, I don't know if that was a cause or effect of moving around so much, but I always read constantly from the time I was very, very little.
We were talking before about memories. Can you remember your first memory at all?
First memory at all?
Yeah.
Not political memory?
No, just in general. I don't see how that's relevant.
I do. It was when my mother brought home my sister.
Remember anything about it?
I can absolutely see her coming through the door with this bundle. I can see myself where I was on the couch. I can remember exactly the way the apartment was.
That's my first memory too, practically. I see her sitting on my lap, and I have to hold her. They're going to take pictures of us, and I'm afraid I'm going to drop her. Wishful thinking. I don't remember being jealous of her or anything. That's not relevant, but it's interesting that Keniston, most of the people that he interviewed, they had a memory. Most of their first memories, whether it was like of their mother's bringing home their first kid, brother or sister, was of sort of conflict and tension. And he's trying to develop this theme. And most of the people in the movement had an early sensitivity to the idea of conflict. Didn't like conflict. I mean, do you see any relationship with that kind of statement that he made to your childhood? What were you going to say your first political memory was?
Oh, well, I was going to say one other thing I remember. I remember getting hurt when I was very young. it was still that apartment. So, and I know we moved fairly soon after Joe was born. I fell on the fire escape and they had to take me to the hospital. So I cracked my head open. Maybe that made me crazy. It's probably what my mother thinks.
Do you want to turn this off for a minute?
Do you want to?
Do you want to?
No, I'm alright.
Okay.
I was going to tell you, my first political memory was the Eisenhower-Stevenson election, which must have been about 3rd grade.
Don't look that up, dear.
Whistle while you work.
I know.
Stevenson's a jerk.
Oh, really?
Eisenhower has a power. Whistle while you work.
You used to sing that?
Yes. I mean, my parents were very clearly Republicans.
Yeah.
I also remember hearing on the radio when Stalin died, because I wanted to know what was happening, and I had this sensation that it was a bear, and that was before I ever saw him. There was this, obviously tremendous tension and sense of relief and, interrupting the radio and talking about it. I do not remember anything about the McCarthy hearings. I never heard of it till I was older.
When you were rooting for Eisenhower, do you remember how you saw Eisenhower, or did you just pick up that your parents were really for Eisenhower, and most of the kids at school were not for Eisenhower, right? Didn't you tell me that once?
No, that was later. That was in Northfield.
Oh.
That was Nixon Kennedy.
Oh, that's right. Do your parents talk much about politics? Do you remember?
Well, I wouldn't say they talk very much about it. Certainly not about political issues very much. When I was a little bit older, my grandfather used to talk to me about Goldwater. But most of the reason we were aware of politics is because my mother had known Jack Kennedy. Not really well, but they used to be on Cape Cod in the summer. And the Kennedy family was there, and she knew one of the sisters and played tennis with her. And so the figure that was most discussed was little Jack Kennedy from Massachusetts, way before he became a national figure, because he was sort of the only one my mother had any personal connection with. But probably politics came up around national elections, but I'd say that was all. They made me go to Sunday school all my life. Yeah.
What kind of Sunday school? What church?
Well, it depends whatever church. Well, all Protestant churches, but it depended whichever ones were nearby. Went to Presbyterian for a while, and I think a Methodist church somewhere, and then we got a Congregational church in Wilton. That's after 5th grade. And I was just mad because they wouldn't go, but they made me go on Sundays.
Did you ever have the feeling that you were different or special in any kind of way? One of the things that Kennison feels about the people that he interviewed was that they had a conscious feeling of being different, special, very early. In other words, that they were important somehow, that they could do something in their lives that would make a difference. Do you think you had that feeling?
No. In fact, I think I was just almost the opposite. I mean, when
this may have a lot to do, with the fact that he was interviewing all men, with the exception of 2 women.
I mean, my father always said I was firstborn and called me that, but in any real way, I think treated us all very equally.
So you didn't get a special sense from sibling rivalry that you were numero uno in the family?
No, in fact, I was numero uno, has been, because my sister Jo was so physically attractive. From the time she was about 7, she was blonde, and then she got a figure very young, and I was this old, lumpy older sister who read books and couldn't do any of the sports or anything else that she did. And I was definitely unhappy because of that,
Mm.
you know, from a very young age.
Did you think you were ugly, really? Did you really think that you were, or did you think that you just were not going to be as good?
Well, I was fat.
Yeah.
It wasn't a question of think. I had to buy clothes in a chubby store. And then when good things started happening, like I got accepted at Northfield, and then, you know, after that, even when I was at Northfield, I mean, I don't know if we got there in the chronology,
We can go on.
You know, a lot of things sort of came my way.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of honors and accomplishments and getting into places and getting jobs, and I was always extremely surprised. You know, and I would say to my father, you know, well, I must be very lucky, and he would say, you're very talented, and I would say, well, you know, no, I'm just lucky.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not have any sense, I didn't even have any sense of being bright. I thought, like when I went to Northfield and I did very well my first semester, I thought, well, it's because I've been in a really good high school,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or I got into Northfield because I've been, junior high.
Mm-hmm.
And especially around 5th and 6th grade, I obviously could do well in school, but I really, it was a game. Already it was a game, and I was just doing enough to get by.
Mm-hmm. What was relevant to you then? I mean, what were your interests?
Brooklyn Dodgers. For my 10th birthday, my father took me to Yankee Stadium. That was that's such a butch.
I know, I was going to ask you if you were a tomboy, but go on.
At the same time, I was not the least bit a tomboy.
I know, I was going to say, you were really quite a femme. You know, you were conforming really in the expectations of a little girl.
Right.
In the sense that, don't you feel that maybe you were very bright in school, including going into Northfield, because can go into that now, but that you didn't feel that, that you couldn't be too smart, that wasn't part of the image that you had of being a little girl? Do you think that's fair to say, or do you think that's a distortion? No.
I don't know. I really don't know. I think that I always worked compulsively because of my energy, you know, that I always studied very hard no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And that I wanted to get good grades, and, you know, my parents were glad when I got good grades. But I was always conscious of my sister, who was really successful in terms of what I thought mattered. It wasn't even so much that I thought I shouldn't be smart, but I should have a good body like she had, and I should have boys looking at me instead of just having crushes. And I did, by the way, have crushes on boys from the 1st grade on. Run around the back of the school and kiss and that sort of thing. And that was always the hardest part of moving. There was always some boy I had a crush on. I mean, that's what really was a lot of it was about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, and I remember when we left Pittsburgh, I had these long fantasies of this wedding play. I mean, we really did a lot of plays then in the 3rd grade. We were going to have this wedding play in the back of the classroom. I blocked that. There was this walk-in closet. That's where it was going to be. Well, that was the question.
Let me just turn it over. Let me just make sure we're back on again. Yeah. Okay. All right. That didn't change it too much. All right. Okay, that's fine. So you were a tomboy in a way. I mean, you were going to talk about the Brooklyn Dodgers, and then you suddenly went off into talking about being boy crazy and having crushes on boys.
No.
So it's sort of a mixed message.
I think there is no way I would have been called a tomboy. My sister Jo was called a tomboy, and I was conscious that I was not. I was called a bookworm.
Yeah.
At some point, I know. I liked Little League because I liked the boys on Little League. And that's what I used to do in 5th and 6th grade. Almost every night after school. After supper, Mother would fix early supper and take us to the Little League game.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got interested in baseball.
Mm-hmm. And the Dodgers too.
Well, the Dodgers, let's see, in 6th grade was when they played at least one of the important pennants. And we used to save our straw wrappers from our lunches that said Brooklyn on it, because we figured the more we saved, the more it would, promote the cause. And I had a friend, actually, who was a lot more of an athlete tomboy than I was. Her name was Lily.
Mm-hmm.
She sat next to me in the 6th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And she and I collected these things together.
Mm-hmm. So summing up before you went into Northfield, how would you, if you were looking on yourself as a stranger, how would you describe yourself then? You were not physically, obviously, but just summing up as a girl. Let me try to help you by saying, did you ever have any sense of being restricted or the sense of restrictions of being a girl when you were that young?
I would say not. Except for this notion that I couldn't just go to California when I wanted to, which I imagined the boys could.
Mm-hmm.
But there were no boys in my family to compare myself to.
Mm-hmm.
I had one boy cousin about the same age, but he was not at all what my parents would consider a good boy role model. I did have my sort of cousin Peter Anderson, who was the son of my mother's best friend Louise.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't see him. Basically I had no one to compare myself to.
Mm-hmm.
Because I did not particularly want to be an athlete myself, and because I was good in school, and that seemed fairly natural, I don't think that I saw that it was going to be a problem being a girl.
Mm-hmm.
We were all girls. My father was there, but he was off and on, and I was very close to him and respectful of him.
Mm-hmm. And your mother didn't steer you all into very little girl girlish things. You were not overly encouraged to spend a lot of time grooming yourself or something. In other words, your parents tolerated a pretty wide range of activities and a certain sense of independence.
Yes, independent was the first word I thought of when I thought about going to Northfield, because I had to move around so much. I didn't even expect to have good friends. I did have a few good friends in 8th grade before I went away, but it still was a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And I was expected to work around the house, and I did all my own laundry from the time I was 12, washing and ironing. And I had a running battle with my mother about cleaning my room, and certainly those things. But then again, Peter Anderson had to do more. As a boy, he had to take out the garbage and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I just assumed that that's what kids had to do,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of share.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of emphasis on me being the oldest and taking care of the other ones when Mother went out.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd done babysitting, I'd earned money, and
So you had a fair sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
Do you remember any, before you went away to school, and then we'll get into school, but do you remember any advice that your parents gave you? Does anything particularly stand out in your mind as sort of explicit instructions on how to live, ethics, morals?
Think before you speak.
Mm-hmm.
My father and I used to have arguments at the dinner table. And I think very young I was aware that my mother would get up and do the dishes. That's about the only time I can think of when I really saw the difference. Is that my father would talk to me after dinner and would use a lot of words that I didn't know, and would have very interesting discussions, and I was mad at my mother that she would not stay for them. On the other hand, I didn't like her very much. And so those were some of the times we talked about why I was going to go away to school when I was young. Stuff like that.
She didn't want you to go away?
No, it was always accepted that I would go away like in my sophomore or junior year. But I remember the conversation where I told my father I wanted to go earlier because I really wasn't getting along with my mother. And it was the whole thing about my younger sister too. I really wanted to be away.
Why did you want to be away from your mother?
We just fought all the time, argued.
About what? She wouldn't let you be as independent as you wanted, or?
Yes, I think it's that I wanted to go out more.
With boys?
Yeah. And we argued about my room, and we didn't like each other very much.
You don't know why exactly?
Well, I'm sure I just thought in general she was trying to boss me around more than I wanted to be bossed around.
When did you go to Northfield? How old were you when you went?
Must have been almost right after my 14th birthday. I was a freshman.
A freshman, by anybody's standards, in other words, in high school.
Right.
And how did you feel about going to Northfield? Did you have any sense that it was a privilege, that it came out of social class privilege that you were going to Northfield, or did you feel because of the kind of school Northfield was, not that sense at all? I mean, in other words.
Well, I didn't set out to go to private school. I looked at Northfield because my father had gone to Mount Hermon, and it was pretty. And I was aware that there were other people in Wilton who were going to private school, and I thought that Northfield was different. I thought it was academic, and I thought there was something sort of better about me, that I wasn't going to promote my social career, which is what a lot of the schools were for.
Yeah. Did you ever feel consciously when you were at Northfield a sense of isolation from people not of your class or race or whatever? Or did you feel that it was integrated enough with working class people and with blacks that you weren't isolated?
Well, if anything, I thought from the time I was first there that I was having a broader experience than the people in my hometown. There were blacks there, and there were working class people. There had been working class people in Wilton, but I think they kept more to themselves. I mean, at Northfield sort of removed a lot of things about people's real situation by putting them there, and everyone had to do domestic work, and everyone had to do classes, and everyone went back to the same dorms. And there really wasn't much sense of who had money and who didn't have money there. And the thing that I thought most strongly was I met people who were Democrats, the Democratic Party, and at first I found that very disturbing because I hadn't known anybody who was a Democrat before.
How did you see them as different? Can you remember?
Well, the thing that disturbed me is one was my history teacher, and one was Dory Wired, who was the dean and was a personal friend. And they were both women that I thought were extremely bright, interesting, lively sort of people. And I just absolutely couldn't understand how they were Democrats, because to me, Democrat had been something weird. I don't even remember exactly in what sense weird, but almost like not respectable. And here were people that I clearly respected. And I remember wrestling with that question. And the Nixon-Jack Kennedy election was my sophomore year. And I had a big Nixon plastic hat, and I wore it around campus. So I was sort of known as the Nixon person. And then I don't know. The day after the election, when Kennedy won, there was a very bad thunderstorm in the morning, and I remember my mother saying, when FDR was elected, there was a very bad thunderstorm in the morning. And I remembered her talking about at some point how my grandfather had been very opposed to Roosevelt. And I thought, well, it's the same thing whenever the Democrats get in. It's just absolute warning of disaster in the sky.
Do you remember if your mother talking or your father talking about the Democrats' disasters? What specifically, anything, or just this general feeling?
I think I thought that they caused the Depression.
Yeah.
Because those are the two things that I heard about. There was a Depression, there was some awful time, and there was this awful man, Roosevelt.
Yeah.
So I put them together in my mind.
Yeah.
Besides, here was now President of the country, little Jack Kennedy from Cape Cod.
Yeah. So you were in the minority as far as Republicans were concerned at school.
I think that's possible.
Was it your first feeling of taking an unpopular political point of view then? Your first time?
Yes, although it ran a close second with another very unpopular point of view, which was to not believe in God.
And when did that start?
Well, by around sophomore and junior year at Northfield. And by the end of my junior year, I was having some very loud arguments with people who were saying, how could I be that kind of person as to not believe in God? And I specifically refused a very interesting position in the church cabinet, the government of the church, because I couldn't carry through with communion and things like that. And so that I really took a stand. And that I remember more clearly.
It was sort of an intellectual process that you went through.
Right, that it wasn't so much hypocrisy, because there were, so many people who professed to be Christian and in fact acted on that at the school. And I remember later when I studied biology more, I sort of would have this almost like an afterthought, like, well, maybe there really was a God because it was all so complex. But that was much later that I thought that. And it didn't convince me anyway. Also, though, a lot of it came from, there is another point, though. One of my teachers was very strict about how you had to pray every day, and how the worst sin was pride. And I really didn't think I was a particularly sinful person, except that I felt proud, that I didn't really want to be humble. I didn't. Okay. It's going?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I think it was a subservient role that I really didn't want to be in the religion, and I had read Ayn Rand's books, and I found her heroines very influential on me, and I wanted to be tough like that. And besides, I didn't have the discipline. I couldn't get it together to pray every day, and so I just felt guilty if I didn't. And so I think that's how I got out of it.
Ayn Rand's heroes who were atheists? I forget.
Oh, yes,
Ayn Rand
they
a
were
lot.
atheists, but they were also, primarily they're just extremely self-sufficient, tough, probably manipulative, sensual women who had their own way and who didn't write thank you notes.
Did you see them as sort of being rebellious? I mean, you identified with them.
Yes, I wanted to
you
be
wanted
tough
to be
like
like
that.
them. Yeah. Is that the first time you can remember reading something that had an impact on you, on your thinking about how you wanted your life to be, or what kind of person you wanted to be?
Oh no, I think everything I ever read did.
Really?
Sure, sure. Like we talked about identifying with Anne Frank.
Yeah.
You know, and the way she was, I certainly identified with that. I don't know, I'd say I want my life to be like that, except that I did want to be honest like she was. She
Anne
seemed
Frank?
yeah,
Yeah.
she seemed to me very open, very thoughtful. Um, I was influenced by the first books I can remember, the Dorothy Daney books, which I look back and I'm about a second grade level. The relationship in that between an upper class girl and a working class girl. And thinking about the two of them, I'm sure had an impact on me.
In what way? I mean, what was the storyline? You read these when you were in second grade?
Second grade, yeah. They were my grandmother's books. And Dorothy was the upper class, proper little girl, and this little girl named Nancy kept going in and out of her life, and Nancy would run away with the gypsies, and I think it was Nancy I identified with a lot.
The working class girl?
Yeah.
Because she was, what, independent and free?
Yes, because she sort of came and went. And because she was rebellious. I mean, and Dorothy was sort of rebellious in a polite way.
So you obviously thought of yourself pretty early on as being rebellious in a certain kind of way. If you identified like that, do you think that's true?
Yes, I think so. I do.
What do you think you were rebelling against? Like in second grade or whatever, in other words, that early period. Just a sort of bad girl peck kind of thing, you know? Doesn't want to be bossed around.
I was, in fact, such a good girl. That it's hard for me to know. I think it was, I wanted to be free. I wanted to be able to travel. You know, in the 5th grade, we did this project where we crossed the country for a report. And we figured out our gas and what our food and everything else. And I took a Volkswagen, and no one had heard of a Volkswagen when I was in the 5th grade. And I tell you, that was my real dream. It wasn't just a school project. I imagined being able to get up and go, and I read all these dog stories and horse stories, and had all these people that just sort of did that and did what they wanted to do. And the first thing I ever wanted to be, that I remember, somewhere in there I wanted to be a nurse, but I knew I didn't want to be a nurse. I knew I was supposed to be a nurse. I wanted to be a forest ranger. That's the first thing I can remember wanting to be.
Do you remember anybody commenting on that, your parents? Were they?
Yes.
What did they say?
They said it was unusual. I don't remember them telling me I couldn't.
Yeah.
I remember when I was fairly young, driving by MIT with my grandmother who lived in Boston and saying, "What's that?" And she said, "That's the hardest school in the country." And I said, "I want to go there." And she said, "Well, you have to be an atomic scientist." I said, "All right, I'm going to be an atomic scientist." So then I no longer wanted to be a forest ranger.
Going back to reading just a minute, do you remember how old you were when you read Anne Frank, and could you elaborate a little on how you felt about that story?
I was in the 4th grade. I think that's 8 years old. I remember they said I was too young
to read the book.
To read that. They said I was too young to read most anything that I read, and what I read was all Mother's Book of the Month Club books. And I just remember being sort of in shock after I read it. I was at my Grandma Dee's house. Yeah, I don't know, because it's all mixed up with later when I saw the movie and later when I reread it. But I know that books always had a tremendous impact on me, and I tended to live in them for a while after I read them. That certainly the characters in them were, in many ways, as real to me as people that I knew. For a while, anyway.
Besides Dorothy Daney and Anne Frank, can you think of any others? Because some later Anne Rand, but any others that had a tremendous impact on you before you went to college?
I remember the first book I read that had any sex in it.
What was that?
That was called Young'un.
How do you spell that?
Young, and I got it off my grandmother's bookcase.
And what did you think of the sex? What happened?
Well, I just remember them describing this naked lady, and she was she worked in the forest or something, and I remember she didn't have any...
She was a forest ranger?
No, she wasn't. She was like in a pioneer story or something. And I remember trying to figure out what part it was about, and then I realized she was going out in the woods because she didn't have any Kotex. And I remember them describing how she was tanned, partly tanned. I mean, maybe it's just the first description of a body. And I remember being somewhat upset. Like I sort of thought I wasn't supposed to read it or something. If they knew what it was about, they wouldn't like it.
Speaking of sex, I remember you told me once about your the first time you learned about sex. Do you want to repeat that just a little bit?
Yes. Well,
I think that's important, don't you, for women?
Yeah. I just knew I didn't dare ask. And
you already had an inkling about it from school or something?
No, I had no inkling at all. I had some pretty grueling fantasies.
How old were you?
Well, let's see. I must have been about in the 3rd grade, because as I remember, my sister Jo was already going to school, and she asked at the dinner table.
And it was not discussed?
No, she said, "Mother, I want to know where babies come from." And Mother looked at me and said, "Well, Sherry, do you know?" And I said, "No, Mother, I don't know." "All right," she said, "well, after we put the baby to bed, we'll talk." So we talked, but it was my sister's initiative, because I didn't really want to know, and I had not heard in school.
And you talked with your mother about it?
Yes, my mother told me.
Oh, I thought your father told you.
Oh no, that was a couple of years later. That was the Reality of Boys lecture, as opposed to Where the Babies Come From.
Oh, well, tell me first what your mother told you and how you felt about it. I mean, sort of,
I don't really remember. The thing I remember most is this embarrassment that I had let my little sister be the first one to ask. If anything, I was relieved, because I really thought it was worse.
Like what?
Mixing bowel movements and eating them. there's a very good one.
Yeah. Whatever made you think of that? Do you know?
Well, it's not far off from what a lot of kids think.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah. Tell me, so you were in 3rd grade then, and then when you were about 5th grade, your father had a special voice or like this kind of lecture. What was that like? What prompted that?
Well, the fact that I was going to be dating. It was sort of, how to be on your guard and what happens to men and how they get aroused and swollen and big, and you have to be careful of them. And your mother and I only slept with each other, and we're glad, and, we hope you will do the same. That was the essence of it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's necessary to get into too much about sex, frankly. But I do think it's relevant about women. I mean, were you upset about the thing where your mother told you about bearing babies? How did you feel about that? Did you think it would hurt? Were you afraid of it, or were you glad that you could?
I don't remember thinking much one way or the other. I certainly wanted to grow up. I mean, I was glad when I started wearing a bra, which I obviously never needed. I got my period early, and I didn't like it, but I was glad.
And you tried exercises to make your breast
yes,
bigger.
Right. Right.
Right. Can you remember any time when you had a sense of that other people were oppressed? I mean, now having grown up to be a radical. Looking back, can you find any root of that in your childhood or adolescence? Do you remember, for example, when you first saw black people being struck by that? Or do you remember your first sense of class?
Well, I remember the first Jewish people I met because I went to camp with them and they couldn't sing the Jesus parts of the songs. They couldn't say the word Jesus, and that made a big impression on me.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I remember being around black people was at Northfield, when there were black students in my class, and I remember looking at them. But I don't remember any sense of their oppression at the time. Particularly this one girl who was just absolutely beautiful girl,
Mm-hmm.
and was always very popular and sought after.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever remember a sense of class?
Yes, I think my first sense of class was in Wilton, where a lot of people had a lot more than I had.
Mm-hmm.
And Darien, the next town, was worse. Well, more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember a sense of not having the right number of circle pins or blouses I don't know if I knew that it had to do with money, though, although my parents were always very conscious about money. We were living in a town richer than we belonged in at the time. And my mother was very apologetic always that we couldn't get more things, but we just had to be careful.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably at Northfields when I first met people who, like that girl I was talking about, whose father was a fisherman.
Mm-hmm.
Again, when I got outside Northfield, I met people who outside Wilton, I met people who didn't have as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And somewhere, I don't know if it came out of having been very involved with the church when I was in 8th grade and when I was first at Northfield, but I certainly had a sort of missionary sense.
About what?
Well, that one of the best things one could do was be a missionary, literally.
Mm.
And
when was this?
probably from 7th and 8th grade, I went to these summer religious conferences.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of church people there who talked about having been missionaries in places, and that always appealed to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of Christianity I really plugged into. You go somewhere and you help somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just very much part of the spirit at Northfield. We had people come speak to us who had been, done Christian work all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
One of Northfield's really famous graduates was Ida Scudder, who had gone to India. Well, her parents were there, and she was a missionary doctor. And James Robinson, who led Crossroads Africa, came to Northfield, and I very much wanted to go to Africa. And it was right about then that the first, the Freedom Rides in the buses was going on in the South. And there were a lot of people coming to school to talk about it, really.
Mm-hmm. And how did you feel about it? Did you feel upset about it?
Oh, outraged.
Yeah.
Outraged, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure my rage was greater again than it would have been in Wilton, because there I was actually around black students.
Mm-hmm.
So I could sort of see, and in fact, that's one way that I don't know how to explain this exactly. But like thinking about the Freedom Rides and looking at Diane
Mm-hmm.
made my rage much greater. And the same way when I was first at Swarthmore, I was really close to Jewish people there. And then I was learning a lot about Hitler. And I always tended to personalize it in some way like that and imagine that it was this person that I knew right next to me that was about to get, killed or mutilated or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents wouldn't let me go on Crossroads Africa. They said it was too expensive. But I persuaded them to let me go to England instead. And that's large. I mean, I really wanted to do something different. And I started working on them to let me go on exchange. Because that was something that was proper and respectable, but also accomplished getting me to see some more of the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So really, there was quite a bit of politics in a sense, or political awareness started way at school at Northfield.
Oh, tremendous amount. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And as far as your images of yourself as a woman, a young woman, it seems that you had very strong models to relate to. Were you consciously relating yourself to people like Dory, women like Dory?
Yes. Yes, and even more the other woman I mentioned, my history teacher. Because that's when I maybe got my first realistic sense of what I might do professionally. I saw her as a history teacher who loved teaching, and who would come into class and just, she was just thrilled about all of it. And I imagined that I would be able to do that. I mean, that was related to a realistic person and thinking that, all right, that's what I would train to do.
Was there any other qualities about either of them that you admired that were sort of new to your imagination as to what a woman could be? Or were there any other qualities in general that struck you about them? What were they?
I think about the thing about Northfield, there were a couple other teachers, that I also identified with very strongly, and that then again, it's almost like when I was young that there weren't any boys. I mean, there were, boys at the other school, but they weren't right close by. They weren't there for general comparison. And it's like, we always used to joke about how the week when we wore, our dungaree skirts and our, ratty clothes and no makeup was a different life than the weekends. When people dressed up, went to Mount Hermon for dates and everything else. But that the real reality, 5 out of 7 days a week, was extremely intelligent, competent women arguing intellectually, arguing morally. It was an extremely stimulating atmosphere. And when I used to visit home in Wilton, I really felt the contrast, because what I saw, and I said from the first or second year I was there, I was glad to be in a girls' school, because I saw my girlfriends at home breaking up their friendships over boys. And I was really upset because there were 3 or 4 of us who were friends, and none of them were friends anymore, and it was all over boys. And I just was really glad I wasn't there. And I was, with these people who, I mean, I loved Northfield. It just appealed to all the best in me. But again, I had this, I didn't feel special. Like, sure, I held a few offices, but it was always secretary of student council or secretary of a class, rather than president. I was invited to be student officer to freshman for my senior year. It didn't occur to me to apply. And yet, I did a very good job. I don't know if this is relevant. I think it is. One of the most difficult things I did was be on the judicial committee my senior year, because that's the first time I ever had any sense of power over deciding people's lives. And we had to, the group made a decision to expel somebody. And I really had an awful time with that. I didn't like it. I agreed with it, but I didn't like it at all.
Mm-hmm.
It was very upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also a secret committee.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like that either.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Okay. Why don't we go into Swarthmore now? And why don't you just tell me what you think was sort of relevant about your getting more involved in politics in Swarthmore?
Okay, we should say one couple things about England.
Oh, yes. Yes, definitely. I'm sorry, that was stupid. Yeah.
Because, I mean, England accomplished what I had always wanted to do, which was go off absolutely by myself.
Yeah.
And I visited an incredible number of people. I lived basically in a school, but, you know, lived with any number of families. It's the first time that I saw admitted class differences. And had this experience where I went from visiting one girl who I'd met in a work camp to another girl who I knew from school, you know, and seeing the tension between the working class girl from the camp, who said she was working class, and her father said he was a worker, you know, and these people that had gold teaspoons. And that made a very big impression on me. I didn't know what to do with it, and I thought the United States was not like that. I mean, my father had told me it was not like that in the States.
Mm-hmm. And you thought that was true, yeah.
Right. Also, on the way over there, I read The Making of a President, the first one about Kennedy, which made it clear to me that I had been misled.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, absolutely, that single book.
Hmm.
And, you know, by the time I finished that book and arrived in London, I was, you know, I thought Jack Kennedy was really something else.
What was it about it? You know, what changed your mind? What did you read that made
It was a lot the way they talked about how he related to the press. I mean, that seems silly, but just like how he related to other people. And it was also reading things like most people vote the way their parents vote.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, that's true. I didn't know anything about the issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found his, you know, youth and energy appealing. And he wasn't either some, you know, idiot from Cape Cod or some, you know, frightening monster. And Nixon came off to be very unattractive in the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was there anything else about England that you wanted to say that sort of changed your life? And
well, that's the first time I ever had a discussion with anybody about what an intellectual was. Because there was a boy, an American boy in the same town I was in. And he told me once he was an anti-intellectual. And I asked him what that was, and then I said, oh, I'm sure I'm an anti-intellectual too. And he said, you couldn't be anti-intellectual because you never were an intellectual.
That's sort of a false argument, I think.
Yes, it was. You know,
but you were very struck by that.
Yes, I was.
Mm-hmm.
I was. Because I really hadn't heard that expression very much, except that someone had told me that Swarthmore was too intellectual for me, and that
Getting close, sorry.
That may be why it made such an impression, because I had not applied to Swarthmore because people I respected said it was too intellectual. Mm-hmm. Then I read all the stuff about the Quakers, and it sounded good, and I knew I was supposed to go there after I went to England. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it was a word that meant something. There were all the students at Northfield who were in very advanced classes that I wasn't in most of the advanced placement classes. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't a word that was used very frequently. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's change the tape.
Okay.
And did anything about the politics of Quakers or Quakerism in general draw you to Swarthmore? You spoke about reading about the Quakers, or didn't it have?
Yes, no, I'm sure it did. I didn't know what to do because by the middle of my senior year, I was supposed to go to McGill, and I didn't think I wanted to, and the only other choice was Dickinson, which I really didn't want to. And Cornell, where I wanted to go, was too expensive. So I got up in the middle of the night one night, and I read the college catalog, that little book that had all the colleges through and through, and I came across Swarthmore, and I thought, now why wasn't I didn't apply? And I wrote my college guidance counselor, and I said, if I could get in, would Swarthmore be too intellectual for me? And she wrote back and said, if you got in, probably not. And I went down over Christmas vacation and visited a girl who had been head of the government at Northfield the year before and who was now a Swarthmore. And she loved it. And that was the real contrast, because everyone else I talked to who'd gone to college had gone to Smith or one of those schools. Particularly, we visited someone at Smith, and she had hated it. She said, it was diddly, it was dumb. Northfield had been much more challenging. So I applied to Swarthmore. But I didn't think I would get in, so I thought I'd go to nursing school. But I got in.
Did you really want to be a nurse?
No. I just didn't want to go to any of those colleges anymore. It was going to be too cold at McGill. I had to do something. That's why I was thinking of nursing school. It was like I would have a skill.
Was there anything you remember reading about Quakerism that especially convinced you? You talked about being in England, reading about the Quakers. Convinced you that you'd made a good choice?
No. I mean, when I got to Swarthmore, I really hadn't studied the whole year I was in England, and I didn't think I was going to make it from college. And when I got there, the headmaster, it was called something else.
The president?
Yeah, the college president, gave this really inspiring lecture about how this was a very selective group of people, and they were bright, and it was going to be exciting. And I mean, I just loved it. I was just thoroughly challenged, and I was amazed to be there. And I thought from the beginning I was there for balance. And I found that the fact I hadn't studied for a year really helped, because everybody else was really burned out from their last year's push to get into college. And I wasn't burned out at all. I had just lived in this nice, quiet society of England and had tea and toast for a year. And I was a lot more grown up and experienced than a lot of my classmates who came, not only right from high school, but right from small towns. And so I really liked it. And right away, in the first 2 or 3 weeks, I got involved with a settlement house in Chester. And that girl Maud that I had visited from Northfield was working there. And so I started going to meetings about that. I started working there right away.
What kind of work did you do?
Oh, we sort of had arts and crafts kind of things for kids, for their after-school program.
Mostly girls.
Yeah. Rough. It was very rough neighborhood. And then by about October of that year, there were a lot of demonstrations in Chester, and a lot of my friends went and were getting arrested.
To integrate, what was it? Kind of demonstrations?
I don't know.
But it
was something about the schools. Yeah, it was civil rights. I mean, maybe it was to integrate the schools. Maybe it was to protest the schools were bad.
Yeah.
Unequal conditions or something like that.
Yeah. And your friends were getting arrested?
Yes, it was definitely, the most violent thing I had run into.
Now this is in 61 or 62?
No, that's the fall of 63.
This is your second year. You went to Swarthmore in 1962?
No. After 62, when I graduated, I went to England for a full year. So then it was 63.
Right.
And there was a tremendous amount of argument, about how could you not go, what were you going to tell your kids if you hadn't been arrested, And I didn't want to go.
Why?
I thought my education was more important. I thought it meant more to stay and study. One other thing, the first weekend I got back from England was Martin Luther King's March on Washington. And I wanted to go and talk for a long time with my the minister from Lebanon in the church. And it was all arranged, and my father said no. And he said no because he was opposed to meetings of large groups, and he said there would be communists there and they would cause violence. And I was forbidden to go. And I didn't know what to do. I had just come back from a whole year by myself. I wasn't used to that. On the other hand, I wasn't willing to make a rupture with my family the first week back. So I didn't go.
What do you think had led you to feeling that was something you wanted to do, to go to the march in Washington?
Well, I had a sort of social concern. Before I'd gone to England, I used to have arguments at the place I worked in the summer at the perfume factory about hiring blacks or Puerto Ricans. I had arguments with the people I worked with and with my boss. You know, we'd had the whole thing about Crossroads Africa, and there had been black people, you know, coming to Northfield, and one of the people, Marion Wright, who came, taught us the song, "We Shall Overcome," in my junior year. And I knew that, and she taught us in the summer, and then we invited her back, and she taught the whole school. Or we learned it before she came, and we sang it when she came back to speak. So I mean, I had a civil rights consciousness already, and also when I was in England, the thing happened about Old Miss James Meredith. And I used to do a lot of public speaking in England, and I was called on to justify, you know, why the United States was that way. You know, and I had tried to talk about that. And I had gone out with an African while I was in England.
I know I was getting back to that. Why, you know?
So it just seemed absolutely natural that I would go.
And what did you say? You knew how you tried to defend America in terms of Old Miss and what was going on racially?
Well, I tried to talk about how the people, from what I knew then, the people in the South, you know, were used to a certain way of life. I also tried to tell English people that they were just as racist, but instead of run up against it.
And you became very aware of that once both when you went to Africa.
Yes, I did.
Can you remember any incidents or any feelings of, I mean, did that open up your eyes in a sense to racial prejudice when you witnessed it?
Well, yes, because for one thing, I tried to have them come visit me at my school, and they were absolutely outrageous. I mean, they just said, you know, we're to pick up wandering Africans on the train, you know, we don't expect us to let you see him. And then he did come anyway, and they met him, and they found out that his family was high up in the Nigerian government. Once now I look back, you know, once they knew his class was all right, they were a lot better about it. But they just couldn't have been more piggy. And my friends were shocked, and they said their parents wouldn't let them go out, you know, with an African. And my parents were pretty good about it.
Did you write them about it?
Yeah.
What did they say?
Well, my mother used to tell me how she'd go to the beach and she'd say, well, my daughter's going out with an English solicitor and an African prince. Which one should she marry? And in that way, she was willing to take on the prejudice by talking to her friends about it in that way. Naturally, no one is that.
I should add one thing. I'm not sure if I really remember now what the purpose of Crossroads Africa was.
Crossroads Africa was very much like a Peace Corps program. Go over, build things, fix things, live in the community, learn language, culture, in a sort of helping little way. And also I had, that was after Swarthmore.
What else? Let's go back to Swarthmore and talk about more of the politics that you started getting involved in.
Right.
Chester incidents and so on. You decided you now want to get involved with this kind of getting arrested. And then what happened after that in terms of politics?
Well, there was a very active group, the politicos, called Swarthmore Political Action Group, SPAC. And I was never part of that. I never went to a meeting. For me, the most radical thing was to meet people who were opposed to the war and meet Quaker pacifists.
Mm-hmm.
And to meet people who later, by say the spring of '65, were marching on Washington. And what I tended to do was use the arguments of one person that I knew against others. Like, for instance, I would use the pacifist arguments of my boyfriend with my father. I'd use my father's arguments with him. And I'd do the same thing in class. I would use his arguments for going on demonstrations against my political science teacher, and then I would take them back and do it the other way. And if anything, I think I would have been considered apolitical as well. I went to Quaker meeting, and I liked the Quakers, and I became, probably a lot more of a pacifist and against the war than I had been. But in contrast to the people who were off getting arrested and who were organizing and, working in Newark in the summer and things like that, I wasn't very active at all.
Can you explain why you were apolitical? Did you violently or actively disagree with some of the things that they were putting out? Or was it more that you had other things that you wanted to do and were sort of bored with it, disinterested? Was it rejection of what they were saying, or was it more disinterest that caused your apolitical?
No, I think it was a combination of disinterest, and I also think I was very intimidated by them. They were very fast-talking, cliquish people.
Mm-hmm. Were there mostly men in the organization?
No.
Yeah, but the women were the same.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the first nice one, the first one who ever, spoke to me with any sort of respect was Vernon Brizard. And I think he had a big impact on me, sort of opening me up more.
Politics or in general?
To politics.
In what way?
Well, it's just that he was a person that I could relate to.
Yeah.
It would be like if, sort of the way I feel about politics now, maybe I could relate more to sort of traditional politics if, I was friends with some congressman who lived upstairs or something.
Mm-hmm. So you just had things in common and you could just relate to them.
Yeah. And the one thing that I ever organized around politics at Swarthmore was to raise money for the Committee of Responsibility, which was for the war-burned children, napalm-burned children.
Mm-hmm.
And I organized an absolutely enormous auction of baked goods. That was a real event, and it raised the most incredible amounts of money.
Mm-hmm. You organized it single-handedly?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. And at the end of it, all those people gave me a book, all the people that I had sort of, gotten to help me organize it. But again, I was surprised. I had not thought of myself as the organizer of it until they all had this little luncheon and handed me this book that they had all signed, thanking me for doing it.
Mm-hmm. What year Swarthmore was
that? That was my junior year.
Mm-hmm. What made you decide? What got you interested in that particular project?
I went to see a lecture and I saw the slides and I was just really upset. Mm-hmm. There was one other thing.
Go on.
Well, I was just going to think sort of about women's consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The thing that I remember starting it most of all is there was a project that a lot of people had worked on, and I think it was in Chester.
Mm-hmm.
And the leader of it came and spoke, trying to recruit people for the following year and the following summer.
Mm-hmm.
And he was perhaps it was a black man, he was maybe the most blatantly sexist person I had run across so far.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about how the women are to stay behind and cook and clean for the male organizers. And I was just outraged and puzzled, and I talked to Muffin about it because she'd been on it, and she had said that's exactly what it was like. Mm-hmm. And I just started talking to people about it. This was all probably my junior year.
Mm-hmm.
Also, my junior year, one thing that I was thinking about is I was supposed to get married. So I was thinking about what it was going to mean to be married.
Mm-hmm.
And I went home, intercession, I told you about this, and sort of looked at my mother's role for what it was, especially the way her best friend Louise was filling in for her because she was sick. And Louise told me women were to pretend they liked football. And I mean, it just, the thing about getting married just raised all the questions, in some ways for the first time, about what I was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because before that, I had been able to get some jobs. I'd worked, in a store and in a factory, and I had done practice teaching, and I had worked in the hospital as a nurse's aide, and pretty much everything that I had wanted, from getting into a good school to going overseas to everything else I had gotten.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know how I was going to handle being married at all, because I thought it would turn me into a different kind of person. And I thought that the reason I was having a problem, because I could see in contrast to my mother that I was more educated.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure I thought I was smarter, but I was certainly more educated.
Mm-hmm. And you'd also been very independent.
Right.
Did you see your independence being cut off? I mean, was that a part of it?
Yes, I did. I mean, Howie was living in this apartment on the second floor of a needlework shop, over a needlework shop with a third floor. And I had this vision of being shut in that apartment. Even though if I had gone there, I was trying to get a teaching job at the Friends School. I planned to work, but I still just had this vision of being shut in this apartment. And I just didn't know what I was going to do. And then I imagined that the rest of my life I was going to be shut in a house.
Mm-hmm.
And I just saw it all lined up in front of me, everything. And I talked to people about, and I read that book, Ginsburg, is it? The Role of the Educated Woman, or something like that. I read that. But I couldn't identify with it because as much as I thought I was educated, I wasn't educated as a scientist or as a businesswoman or as anything. I just sort of was smart.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to be a school teacher. I was pretty sure of that by that time. I had done practice teaching. I had liked it. But that was not a professional identity that was going to carry me through as a woman. That was going to be something I was going to do and be a wife and mother.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't occur to me to be just a professional woman because I wasn't trained in anything.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't see that as a clear option?
No, I always assumed I'd get married.
Mm-hmm. How did you resolve it in your mind as you moved into finding marrying Marty?
Well,
the thing about being trapped. And yet
first of all, I got out of that relationship.
Do you think there was something special about Howie and that relationship which made you feel trapped? Was there anything that he did?
No, not particularly. I mean, he was very capable, verbal, aggressive man,
mm-hmm.
but he also had tremendous respect for me,
mm-hmm.
And had no intention of putting me down.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and if anything, thought I was more capable than he was.
Mm-hmm.
He was argumentative, and the kind of man I turned to was, very quiet, very female
mm-hmm.
by traditional standards, although gay.
Mm-hmm.
Jewish, sort of more of a problem.
Mm-hmm.
There was a large element of identifying with the oppressed people.
You mean in getting involved with Marty, it was a way of acting out, being identified, or doing something about for oppressed people.
Right, and there was even an article in one of the Sunday magazines that year about why all the blonde shiksas were going out with all the Jewish men.
Mm-hmm.
And it was from both. I mean, it was maybe not that year, but shortly after, because neither of them liked the way the world was being run by white WASP men.
Neither
meaning the WASP women
mm-hmm.
and the Jewish men.
Oh, I see.
So it was
so
like
they could get together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did his politics have anything to do with it besides being Jewish, which is more of an identity thing
Uh,
in the very beginning? Well,
yes,
altogether.
the first real conversation was around Hitler.
Mhm.
Hitler and pacifism.
Mhm.
Because Hitler was like the real question, if Hitler's trying to kill him, are we then pacifists?
Mhm.
I don't remember the answer,
Mhm.
but I do remember it was a big question.
Mhm.
And he also liked the Quakers, and he also had worked at White House, the settlement house. And
Just going back to Swarthmore again, you pretty much told me all the political things. When was the time when you started doing anything with, feminism? Wasn't there something that you organized with Swarthmore? I know there
no,
was.
I talked to people about organizing a conference
Oh.
on the role of the educated woman.
Oh.
We didn't do anything about it.
Did you want to say anything?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, and I talked a lot with my friends. And in fact, that's when I first made friends again with women really my last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked with them about it.
Mm-hmm. Have you read anything, Sharon, when you were at Swarthmore besides Ginsburg's thing? Say like the feminine mystique or anything that might have had something to do with your ideas about marriage, suddenly thinking about it being very restrictive. I mean, obviously it might have just come from confronting the real fact of it.
No, I had heard of the feminine mystique, but my mother had tried to read it and said she hated it. And I still, even though she said she hated Shakespeare and I loved Shakespeare, I still responded like I wouldn't like it.
Yeah.
I didn't read it until several years later.
Yeah. When you talk to other women about their feelings about marriage, did you tend to get back agreement? I mean, was it encouraging or did you feel isolated in your feelings about marriage and your possibilities as a woman in the future?
Well, I think we were all going through absolute terrible conflicts about marriage, and it was all involved with sex because we were virgins and because we definitely felt the societal pressure to remain virgins until we married. And that the question of marriage absolutely hung over everybody. We didn't really think about not getting married and still living together or anything like that. And in that way, I don't think we represented a very large part of the Swarthmore population. I think a lot of people were living together. But just the fact that there were, it was like always the virgin question loomed large the whole time I was there for me and my friends. And also there was this mixed feeling because we knew that everybody got married when they got out of school. A lot of people did. We knew that a lot of those marriages didn't work. But we also had this sort of mythology that there weren't very many other people like Swarthmore people. And that is maybe the first time I ever identified with a group where I felt different.
Was it because you'd gone to Swarthmore?
Because I was at Swarthmore, and even if I was there for balance, there was a certain thing about the people who had gone through that experience that meant others like ourselves were going to be hard to find.
Yeah. How did finally you did get married? I mean, what did that have to do with going to Appalachia? And how did you decide to go to Appalachia?
Right. Well, I wanted to go to Appalachia. I did not want to go to graduate school. I was sick of school. I wanted to do something in the real world first. I thought from my experiences in Chester that I should not try to work in a black slum ghetto. I thought I should work with whites. I did not want to work in suburban Boston. I was going with Marty then. And I had visited Appalachia when Howard was working there. And from the minute I walked into the first one-year school, I thought that's what I wanted to do. So
Why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just it was a combination of the sort of romanticness, stepping back in history to the pot-bellied stove and the little barefoot kids, plus feeling like I would be in control, because it would be my school and I could try all the ideas for education that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And that it was politically correct to work with white people. And I didn't know anything about class on any political level.
Mm-hmm.
So it seemed to meet all those needs.
Do you seem implicit in that is that you felt a need to do something with your life to help other people?
Oh, absolutely.
You felt that consciously?
Yes, so that nothing else was an option, really.
That was so much by then a part of you that it obviously wouldn't even be something you could mention.
Right, but also because I wanted to teach. I mean, that I had decided consciously.
Yeah.
So it was a question of where I would teach.
Yeah, yeah.
And Marty was in graduate school at Harvard and didn't want to leave because he'd lose his grad department. And so did not want to go to Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
Also, he'd been there summer before and didn't really want to go back. But I was going. So I went, flew down there by myself, had an interview, got a job, and we had endless arguments that summer where he said if I would just say I was going wherever he would go, then he would go with me to Kentucky. And I don't remember if I ever actually said that, because it became very clear to me it didn't matter whether I was telling the truth or not, even to him. I just had to say it.
So you did say it?
I don't remember. I must have said it since that was the condition. And the first part of the summer, we were at Pendle Hill for a 3-week study session that summer.
Is that a Quaker retreat?
It's a Quaker study center.
Yeah.
And we fought the whole time. Oh, terrible. By then we were sleeping together. I'd gone on a pill and we were sleeping together. Sometimes, whenever we could. Anyway, excuse me.
Quite all right. Just a minute. I think we'll just change this tape now.
All right.
Anyway. We were talking about Kentucky and how you went down there and how you were arguing with Marty.
Right.
I think that's very interesting as an example of sort of independence that you felt, really, and how, in a way that you resolved the question of marriage by deciding just to be very independent. I mean, it was an unusual kind of thing to happen, I think, in the 60s in a marriage.
Right. Well, basically, it's true. We did what I wanted to do, and we had an agreement that we would do what he wanted to do the next year. And then we read that Bertrand Russell went somewhere for a year to be with his wife for the first year. So he felt better about it.
Yeah. So you went to Kentucky. Now, was this under a special political program, or
no? I was hired by the Board of Education. Marty went down without a job, which was part of the problem.
He dropped out of Harvard.
He took a chance he could lose his draft deferment. Mm-hmm. He was applying to be CEO, but he didn't really want to have to deal with it. He wanted to keep his deferment. Mm-hmm. He later got a deferment for asthma, anyway.
Former asthmatic. Right. So you were hired by the Board of Ed.
I had a job. I thought I knew what school I was going to teach at from the first time I went down there, but they put me in a school in the community where he had lived the previous summer. Mm-hmm. And he had thought he would work for Vista, but that didn't come through. So then he got a position teaching in one room school on the other side of the county, which was 15 miles each way. Mm-hmm. So we both started teaching school. He lived with a family that he had lived with before, and I lived with their cousins down over the hill.
At any time during the time when you were both teaching in Appalachia, which was for a couple of years, right? This was 1 year, 1967 to 68. Mm-hmm. Did you get involved with any of the political organizations in Appalachia or feel involved in that?
Yes, we used to go to meetings. I guess Marty knew some of them from the summer before. Mm-hmm. And we met with we did sort of two kinds of political things. We worked with community people on community projects. There was a sum of money that was supposed to be given to the community, and they were trying to decide how they were going to use it, whether they're going to use it for a garage or to build a dump, or I'm not even sure what else. Mm-hmm. And we'd go to those meetings. Then we also were meeting with other people other other white people came from outside organizers.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a number of groups of them, and they all sort of knew each other. And some of them worked for Vista, and some of them worked SCAF.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked all around, some based in Berea. The McShirleys were in Pike County.
Mm-hmm.
There was someone whose name I can't remember who was in Jackson. And we did spend quite a bit of time traveling to talk to them.
And what did you talk about? Just organizing problems and...
Yes. And, how to get things funded, and I can't remember really. I do remember that year talking about, we talked a lot about what it meant to live there.
Mm-hmm.
And what it meant to be outsiders, and what it meant that, we might live at a similar lifestyle that they were living at in terms of, not having an indoor toilet and not having running water, but how in our heads we weren't like that. Even if we didn't ever leave, we still knew we could leave, which made a difference.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel guilty about that?
Probably. I felt very mixed because in some ways I think I felt more comfortable there than I had in a while.
Why?
Well, because the big conflict I'd gone through about going to graduate school was the whole sort of intellectual, materialist lifestyle. It was materialist in, the expensive peasant dresses and the good wines and the gourmet food and all that kind of thing, which really wasn't what I was used to.
Mm-hmm.
In that sort of lifestyle. And I was there, I could, buy my clothes at the secondhand store and, eat whatever ordinary food people had. And, it was easy going. I liked being around families. I think being around families with kids and everything like that was had a big impact on me in terms of getting married. And I thought at the time that if we'd been living in Boston, first of all, we wouldn't have had to get married.
Mm-hmm.
Because we got married so that we could be more convincing in the political work we thought we were doing. We thought that, if they knew we were going off to Lexington every once in a while to stay overnight,
mm-hmm.
that it sort of undermined our moral case for being organizers or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And how did you see yourself organizing with people? What were you trying to do to them or for them? Do you know what I mean?
Well,
what case did you have that you wanted to be convincing?
Well, it was a lot of sort of community improvement. I mean, I was always glad that I had a real job, because that way I could justify how I was there. I was teaching some kids to read.
Mm-hmm.
And I was working, and I was a working member of the community.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, in fact, extremely uncomfortable with the organizers who were just full-time organizers. I couldn't really understand it.
Mm-hmm.
It was clearer in Pike County where they could organize to stop the coal mining, the strip mining. It was not so clear in Wolfe County because there was nothing. There was no money, no industry.
Mm-hmm.
But it was important to get a dump. So we were trying to get people together to get a dump or start a garage with government funds. I mean, there was a lot of feeling that there was money to be spent, to be brought in. Mm-hmm. If there was a way of getting people together to use it. Mm-hmm. And there was a quilting co-op that was starting and things like that, so that it was like there was contact being made with outside.
During this time that you were working in Wolfe County, did you feel like you were a radical? Did you identify with the movement in the sense that there were so many people doing things like that? This was the time when SDS was moving out into local projects in New York and so on and trying to improve people's lives and help them.
Right. Well, I went to my first and only SDS conference that year because it was in Lexington. And I remember when we talked about, as I started to say this before, about what it meant to live there. I remember Marty using the word movement and needing to be in touch with the movement. And I remember saying, what do you mean? What is that? That I hadn't heard that word when I was in Swarthmore, really. Mm-hmm. Maybe civil rights movement, but not this the capital M movement, sense of identifying with all these people. Mm-hmm. And
I don't know that I did identify with it. We got whatever it was, the Guardian and the SDS paper. We had those things sent into Kentucky. But I really didn't identify it with because I really didn't like those people. I like the mountain people fine. I didn't like, especially the men who were really running things. I mean, I didn't see that until a lot later. These sort of macho people who thought that their lifestyle, of staying up all night and sleeping all day, was right on, and they thought they were so important, and I didn't think they were. I thought it made sense to be a teacher there.
You didn't see that they were doing anything?
No, I didn't. I didn't see that anybody there had done anything. Who'd come in and gone out again. And I felt all the time like we were imposing. I thought this going around from house to house and talking and letting people, I mean, it's true, they talked a whole lot about their problems and their feeling of protest and their need to get things changed. But at the same time, they fed us, they gave us their time, they gave us their beds, and I really, a lot of the time, felt like I was imposing and was very conscious of my language and that I talked differently. And I also found it extremely difficult to know how to help people the more I tried. We'd never quite know whether you can buy a fan for somebody that doesn't have any way to cool off at all, or whether that makes them feel worse.
Is that part of the reason why you wanted to leave Kentucky? Or was it just an accident that they didn't have the money? Is that right?
No, we decided to leave. One of the things, Marty quit teaching in one-room school because he hated it. And then he taught for a while in high school, and he hated that just as much. And another reason that we got married is because he was going to leave if we didn't. That he didn't want to be there. There was no work for him. And so as early as when we got married, the next day we came to Washington, and I had an interview at Sidwell, and he had an interview at the Institute. And so we were already planning to come to Washington by that next June. It was a question of getting him to stay there.
You got married when you pretty much first went to Kentucky, but you were already planning to go?
No, we got married. We decided to get married in about early December when he quit the one-room school.
Of what year?
Of 67. We got married in February of 68. And came to Washington in June of 68. And he knew about the Institute through stuff he'd read in The Guardian or something, and he started writing to them.
And how was your marriage progressing? Were you satisfied with him that whole year in Kentucky? In general, did you feel trapped the way you thought you were going to be? You don't have
well, I was hysterical for about 2 weeks for a couple of reasons. One, because I didn't have my name. 2, because I had to pee in the pot and I was embarrassed.
What do you mean?
Well, we didn't have a bathroom and we lived in this trailer, and it was too cold to go out to the outhouse. And the trailer was about as big as this room. And to go to I had to go to the bathroom in front of him, basically, right in front of him. And also from the beginning I cooked. I remember the first night down there so well. Oh my God. And
this is after you were married?
Yeah. Because we hadn't lived together at all before that.
Yeah.
And, there was nothing he could eat. He didn't like anything. There were only about 2 things I could cook, and I couldn't fix bacon. And he was very slow. So I was always late to work because I was waiting for him. And, some of it was good and I was happy and we were romantic and all that, and it was a cute little trailer we had. But I really think that I was, making a big effort to adjust.
You think it was to a particular man or in general?
No, it was in general. I think he was Well, I was going to say more helpless than most men, but I'm not sure that that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to he was more helpless than Howie.
Mm-hmm.
But then Howie was extremely confident really in everything,
Mm-hmm.
household stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also sick a lot. And he was also very unhappy in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I might have stayed by myself, you know. It was just like I got cold feet because sometimes I used to picture myself here by myself and think I'd be very happy. You know, I decided if it was just me, I'd walk to my schoolhouse every day and things like that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we actually talked at the time about how, you know, he tried to tell me I hadn't lost my name. You know, it was now my middle name. And I said to him, well, it wouldn't be this way about the cooking and everything if we had just lived together in Boston. You know, I said, I feel like the label of wife makes me act in a certain way that I don't want to act, that you don't necessarily want me to act, but I feel the label very strong. You know?
Like you mean having to cook for him?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And the way we equalized things was because he had to shave in the morning and I had to cook breakfast.
Did you really feel that that was an equalization?
No, I thought that was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I accepted it because we were always late anyway. So then we moved to Washington. It took us a whole summer to move. We kept going back and forth.
Mm-hmm. And you went to the music studio and you got the job. I think it was part-time, maybe study.
No.
No.
No. That was fifth grade time.
Full-time?
No.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I don't think that's what I expected to teach. I think that's all they had in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So I said I would do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And once I started teaching that September, which is really when we moved in, I spent a great deal of time doing it. I mean, I really didn't know science very well, so I had to.
Mm-hmm.
But I also got very involved in the beginning in sort of the internal politics of the school.
Mm-hmm.
And I met a lot of people there that I liked. And I very much, you know, had my own life and was glad for it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas that hadn't really been true in Kentucky. I mean, I had my own school, but that had been very, you know, difficult experience as well.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I did go through a lot of culture shock going from Kentucky back to Washington, especially with such a rich school.
Mm-hmm.
I was angry a lot of the time as a kid because they had no idea how wealthy they were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how did you socially involved in the politics in Washington? When was that? Was that at the beginning of your fall?
No, it's not, because in fact, the first thing I did was while I was still in Kentucky, in one of those magazines, The Guardian or the SBS paper, Marilyn Webb wrote a sort of letter or an article about women's reading. And I wrote a letter to her from Kentucky and got on some kind of mailing list and started getting a newsletter that was being published in Chicago. It was probably the first one I know. I can't remember what it's called. And so then when I came to Washington, I called Marilyn Webb and she said, oh, you're the girl from Kentucky. Which meant a whole lot of things, you know. And I told her I was well, she thought I was a real Kentucky person, you know.
Right. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Go on.
So she said not too much was going on about anything. But I told her she was trying to get together with people. Because I encouraged students like that to students, and I thought it would be helpful. Mm-hmm. And she had used to organize that because she had a whole list. Mm-hmm. So I got a list from her and I started looking at teachers. Mm-hmm. And I got together a few meetings. Mm-hmm. But I don't remember the name.
It was citywide, wasn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. people teaching like at Edinburgh, people in the new education project, and isolated teachers teaching in different countries. Think about one thing. What made you, what's going on in your head when you decided to write from now and then speak to your community, whatever that means? What made you do that? Well, it's like I saw it as someone else thinking the same kind of thing I was thinking. What about getting women together to figure out sort of how they were going to survive with what they were supposed to do? And Marty knew about that. And we had a lot of questions about women's roles because people had always told us that our roles were good. That I was strong and rescue, more masculine, and he was feminine, was strong, quiet, all those things. So we were very conscious of the role. We did, what was expected of people. That, and I'm sure he pointed that to me, read that stuff. After the sort of the board becomes organized, that is the teacher. Did you keep up your contact with Marilyn and Beth, or how would you, and what happened then about them? Well, the way I actually got involved in the first meeting that I went to was to Kathy Wilson, who was active in SPA, greater than other people, and had been a sophomore leader before. And was Kathy Wilson from the group in the town, also the family places, who just gave them to them. And I'm sure she was around the Institute of she was sort of in the extended community. Had you known Kathy Wilson? No, not personally. I sort of recognized her because she was a friend of Brian. And I talked to her once or twice. I think when she came back to visit me last year. And I ran into her somewhere, and she said, we're going to have a study group, and handed me in the book, The Origin of Family Comprehensive States. And I thought, oh my God, I hadn't read a book like that since Blackmore. I never wanted to read a book like that again. Anything that had anything to do with that kind of academics, I thought I couldn't do. But I thought I was from those meetings. And I damn well better be prepared because I knew she was one of the smart ones. So I read the book and I thought it was fabulous and I understood it and I went to read it prepared and it's one of the most exciting reading and thinking and discussing experiences I've had in about 5 or 6 years. And I was obviously way better prepared than most of the people because most of the guessing is not prepared. You look at now and and I must have met with that group maybe 4 or 5 times, and then I started meeting other people who were in other, in other countries, and trying to find out what people were doing sports counseling. I went to meeting in the country on that, so there was a big fight about childhood education, because there was a woman in the school organization. She said, no one is helping you take care of your baby. So I said, I was helping you take care of your baby. And Marty and I started trying to take care of it. We would do it together. And before you go into the family, you were supposed to get involved with asking to what was it about it? What was it particularly from you were so excited to do? I mean, could you sum it up a little? Well, I can hardly remember it, but what I think it is basically saying that the state of segregation is not inevitable, was not always the way it is. So there's a relationship between well, like the thing about capitalism, like why it's like it is. I mean, I wasn't particularly associated with, too much about it. I wouldn't have said I was a communist, and I think really, but it was just that this wasn't necessarily the total truth, because I always looked at it as this is the reality and this is the truth. And it was like, it hadn't always been that way, which meant it didn't always have to be that way. But you say that was easy. Obviously, this has been very convincing and seriously intended. And that's really the moment, the intellectual moment, anyway, and everything fell into place, and your own personal situation, you think, feeling like you can, yeah, well, yeah, that over. No, that was absolutely, that's what, was there and important. That was more than the meeting itself. And I think it's a mistake at this point to call it feminism at that point, because it wasn't for a woman, it wasn't so female values, it was equalizing roles. It was not focused on women. It was a scale that was out of kilter, and it was trying to put a scale in kilter. Family, right, the nuclear family, in terms of responsibility, power, equal opportunity, things like that. And it wasn't focused on women for a long time at all, as a use of distinction. In fact, I remember we talked about when we first heard of this, when we got this stuff from Boston called the Female State, and they were calling themselves, I guess they were calling themselves feminists. It sounded very strange to me, and they were separatists, although not lesbian separatists, and they were separatists in the idea. And I remember thinking, boy, I must be awful great, anybody must be getting to be a community. The first wave of the was very much men and women, a certain excitement, a certain amount of teasing and joking, but very much couple meeting together where the women had something to say to each other, but it's just a tremendous deal of rapport and fun, and it's like social and brilliant and inspiration. That's pretty. It's a lot of the men, especially when they're in an institute, is so intellectual. That the most they ever did was have a community supper. And it's like it was the women's life force, the sort of enthusiasm, the dancing, the partying, the getting together, more dinners, sort of high spirits as opposed to intellectual, political examination of the realities of the world. And I think that, the good spirits is contagious. And there's almost no hostility. With a few exceptions, like when the COVID system is being elected, you come to our meeting and ask for help. That's horrified. So what's the study? You got been involved in this study with men and women. What was the purpose of it? Did it start as a Marxist study, or did it start as a woman's kind of, it was an all woman's group, obviously. Yeah, well, a woman's caucus out of this whole section? Well, it was an intentionally women's study group. There had been that meeting in Chicago in November before that. The people from the context against the doctor, and So that was like the first national youth experience around this particular movement. And people came back from that beginning to say we do certain things, and I think they studied it. Yeah. And what else did you do in the year? Mostly did you do things else? Yeah, discussion. You know, I can't remember reading it enough. I think it was missing. But it wasn't a consciousness. It was no way that we think of one. No, and it was not that term at that time. Yeah. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, this picture, I guess I was about 3. I guess I was about 2.5 or 3 when that picture was taken. I like it a lot. I was really delighted to find it partly because of holding the book, because one thing my parents called me all my life, besides procrastinator, was bookworm. And there I am, even that young with the book. It's also before I got fat. I was about 8 years old in this picture, and I can remember, not when the picture was taken, but I can remember those dresses very clearly. They were white and brown and turquoise. And it's sort of some of the first clothes I can remember that I really liked. I think the picture is interesting in terms of family relationships that it shows. Like already my sister Jo is, sitting up straight and full of confidence, and she's now a surgeon. And I'm sort of squatting down and looking queerly out at the world. And my little sister Martha, with all her, energy and everything, it's interesting. She's the only one with a doll because she's the only one now with a child of the 3 of us.
How do you see yourself in this picture as the queer? I mean, how do you see that as a sign of things to come, your lesbian future?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's not really, because at the time, and for 26 full years of my life, I knew nothing about it. It's projecting, from what I know, of my later life back into the picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I was about 16 when this picture was taken. We were going to a dance in the summer, and things I noticed, like the earrings and the red lipstick and the red nail polish, all the things that I did just like my mother. The boy I went out with most of the time that I was in high school, off and on.
Name?
Jay Clark is his name. And he told me he liked me because I was so different. At first I was insulted, but then I liked that. And it's interesting because I thought that I was very unpopular all during high school because I wasn't sort of asked out on dates by lots of different boys, but in fact I dated regularly several boys.
And why did you think he was different? What was different about him? What do you think he meant?
I actually think he meant I was more direct. It's interesting that this is really the only picture I have from high school, and that I don't have pictures of Northfield, because when I remember that time period, I remember mostly the people in Northfield and my studies and my friends there, my activities there. When someone says to me high school, I don't think so much of dating, but more of my school life. This picture was taken when I was an exchange student in England, the year following graduation from high school.
And what school did you stay in?
Malvern Girls College.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the picture, the thing I remember most is how much I actually enjoyed wearing school uniforms, because it took away the hassle of how you presented yourself every single morning. You knew you had a choice between a blue blouse and a pink blouse, and that was all. I also see that I had reached about my fattest stage when I was there, eating to keep warm, besides my natural tendency to overweight.
Well, that doesn't show in these pictures at all. I think that's interesting. I mean, do you think that's an example of women being overly conscious of their physical appearance?
Yeah.
Inferior, about any deviation from the norm, size 7?
Please don't use the word deviation.
Sorry.
I think that's true. I think it was, as I told you before, partly comparing myself to my sister, besides to the, I don't know if it was Barbie dolls then, but some norm.
And yet you say, as you look back on high school, you were popular, you were dated, so that in fact it wasn't a reality, that you didn't meet the male standards of the marketplace.
No, but I didn't realize that because to me the goal was to be so attractive that some boy would take one look at you and come over and say, "You're the one, go out with me Saturday night." And that never happened. I got to be friends with boys and meeting them in more casual situations at the beach or in my hometown, something like that.
So anyway, as you look back on your experiences with boys, you never really felt a sense of inadequacy about dating men.
No, I did, and that's the irony, because with hindsight, I see that I had several boyfriends. I knew at the time that I was unusual because I dated a couple boys at the same time because my living situation was in different places, and I used to joke about one in every port. But still, even so, I didn't think I was popular.
I think the reason this is important is that a few people have always tended to theorize about women activists, especially women in women's suffrage movement and the women's liberation movement, as the reason that they are politically active and rebelling against the social role of a woman is because they didn't meet the standards, particularly that they were unattractive or had a history of failure with men. And how do you react to that in terms of your own life? And that's why I'm focusing on this question.
Yes, it wasn't true in my case. I had consistently, long-term relationships with boys. Never one date, and usually about a year, at least. And at most times I was in a relationship with somebody. I mean, there were very only short periods of time when I wasn't, having some kind of relationship with some boy. Say from the time I was ninth grade.
So you don't think it would be fair for anyone looking at your life to say that the reason this woman rebelled had something to do with her physical looks or came out of a sense of inadequacy in the traditional female role?
No, I mean, I would say yes, despite all the facts, I felt inadequate as a female, but I would say that my protest came more out of protest against the female role than out of failure at it.
And you don't think that the feeling that you had of inadequacy made you more sensitive to some of the oppressive parts of the female role?
Possibly. Yes, quite possibly.
That's just playing the devil's advocate. You can't remember any time when that might have occurred to you that you sort of saw through the whole game.
Well, I mean, yes, I didn't want to have to be so attractive and well dressed, that I would be snatched up immediately and taken to the suburbs.
That was a later feeling, wasn't it? In college?
No, that was true in high school. I mean, one of the boys that I was friends with named Bob, his dream was to be a horse wrangler in Montana, and we always talked about how neither of us wanted to do the sort of expected suburbia trip.
And you think that might have some relationship to the way you looked or the feelings you had about the way you looked?
No, I'll go back and change the possibly. I don't think so.
What do you think it came out of? You were just smart.
Yeah, I was smart. I think like we talked about on the other tape about how I just saw the conflict between what I was expected to do and what I wanted to do. And it was more around work. Because in fact I did want to be popular and attractive. That part of it I wanted. I just didn't want to have to get locked into the rest of my life as a wife and mother.
Because you had so much other energy.
Yeah.
And many things you wanted to do.
Yeah. This picture was taken at Swarthmore by Howie Evans, who was my boyfriend for the first 3 years I was there.
I don't remember the time there being quite so carefree as this picture. On the other hand, I do remember they said, friends of mine said to me, I couldn't be either very bright or very sensitive if I was as cheerful a person as I was. Which both made me mad and made me question, whether or not it was true. And I remember thinking when I was at Swarthmore that like all the movies and all the intellectual books and everything were a conspiracy to make me think that life wasn't worth living. And I never knew what to do about the art films like Bergman that I didn't understand. I think partly while I was at Swarthmore I didn't think I was an intellectual, so it made it a lot easier to get through. I just sort of, enjoyed being there and did what work I could and wasn't particularly intimidated by the place. I'm smiling here in this picture, graduation picture, the way one is supposed to, but in fact I was furious the day I graduated from Swarthmore. The president of the college in his commencement address said the school was a corporation and would be run as such, and congratulated the parents and the faculty and on the side the students for not being rabble-rousers like they were at Berkeley. And one of my friends refused her degree as a result. I was disgusted, and I think it sort of pointed out to me that I had changed politically more than I had realized. And I said to myself that day, well, if I hadn't gone to Swarthmore, maybe I wouldn't have learned enough to be as angry as I am. It also, that evening, was discussion of what he had said and what had happened was really one of the biggest breaking points with my father. When the changes that had happened to me sort of in the time I'd been there became very clear to both of us. And I don't, it was years before, maybe not even now, we were as close as we were before that happened. I was disgusted at President Smith's attitude and his assumptions about what kind of students we were, and his attitude that school was a business. I saw it as a place of learning and rebellion. or maybe just learning to be rebellious.
Yes, you can add that.
I was extremely proud of Ingrid and had very mixed feelings that I had accepted the degree myself. My father's major objection was that she had refused the degree that her parents had worked so hard to pay for. The day I got married wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. I really hadn't wanted to go through the whole thing about getting married, and, for political reasons about living in Kentucky, we decided we had to, but I still had dreaded the wedding itself. The two sides of the two families were quite friendly to each other and really made an effort around the issue of a Jewish-Christian wedding, and that was encouraging to me.
Have you seen yourself in the picture you look like?
Yes. I was, actually, and that's, I think, what surprised me. I was having severe culture shock because we were teaching at the time in Kentucky and had flown up for a long weekend. And, the silver wedding presents and everything else had me really in shock compared to the way I was living in Kentucky. But, again, despite that, everybody made an effort to make it a happy occasion. The little girl with me is Kim, whose family I had lived with, and I had babysat for her for 2 years while I was at Swarthmore. In fact, I was thinking about how it was her parents were having a very difficult time with their marriage while I was living there, and it was largely through talking to them that I had so many questions about marriage, or they had sort of, their experience reinforced my questions about marriage. And in fact, at the time, they had already split up right after I moved out. I would also add that I see Marty's mother looking at me with a tremendous amount of expectation, which I was never able to fulfill in any way, whether it was writing thank you notes or being the right kind of daughter-in-law to her only son, or converting to Judaism or anything like that. I think this picture represents a lot about what was best about my teaching experience in Kentucky. Of all the things I tried to teach to all the different age children, I really felt that I helped a lot of them learn to read
and that this is one reading group being interrupted by a child from another level reading group. Also, I see myself in the 10-cent dress I bought at the secondhand store and the big lard can of water that we hauled in from the well nearby. I felt mixed about having a writer-photographer from my hometown come do a story on me for a national magazine, because I never liked the image or the reality in some ways of being the middle-class girl going to help people out. And I wanted to sort of tell myself that it was a really natural thing for me to be doing. On the other hand, I was conscious that the rest of the world was really unaware of what it was like in eastern Kentucky, and so I agreed to be in the article. Well, these tough little ladies were my students in my first time that I taught women's studies. We had met once a week for almost a full academic year when I took this picture. The class was a non-credit course open only to women. And in the process of teaching the course, I sort of worked out a women's studies curriculum. I think that the course was really good to have at 7th grade, because 7th grade was exactly the time when kids were most faced, or maybe first faced so directly with the question about what they are going to be as young women, as opposed to elementary school children. And like the range in their growing up was very evident right there in the classroom. I think also they were conscious of a women's movement beginning to grow around them, and they would notice things in the media and felt like they were participating in something that was happening besides just talking about sports in school and attitudes toward good grades in school and things like that. This picture is taken probably within the same month as one of the kids at Sidwell, and it's interesting because it sort of represents the difference. I mean, the teaching at Sidwell was like the transition away from my former life, and this picture, although it isn't apparent, represents everything that was happening. When we testified at the Senate, I was it was the first time I had done anything sort of public like that, and I was intimidated going into the sort of high offices of the country to present our case. But I mean, even more than that was going on, because the other woman, well,
Far left?
yes, the woman on the far left, Joan, was at the time my lover of about 2 weeks, and that whole question, what that was going to mean, and everything was really what was foremost in my mind. As I remember, we stayed up most of the night before making love, and so we were exhausted and high, and I was very confused about, what it really meant for my life. It didn't, because she and my husband and I were all three relating to each other. I saw that as some kind of new form of relationship, and did not immediately identify that it was lesbian, although that word kept occurring to me, and I wondered if it did apply to me. Joan and I were both very active in the movement at the time, in the women's movement at the time, and I think our primary fear was not what it would do to my relationship or her relationship with my husband, but what it would do to our work in the movement. And we were, afraid people would find out, and not at all sure how they would react, except I kept thinking we will be kicked out of the women's movement, which was my life, practically 24 hours a day. I don't know who took this picture. The first time I saw it was when I saw the book in the bookstore. It was taken on the day of the August 26th women's strike, and that day certainly seemed to be a turning point in many ways. Turning point, high point, I'm not sure which. First of all, it was like our first really public demonstration that involved a lot of people in Washington. One of my Sidwell Friends students spoke at the rally about women's rights in the junior high. We marched on the women's prison, which turned into a very awkward and upsetting affair, and weren't sure afterwards why we did. And that that weekend was the occasion of the first women's dance for women only in Washington, where, some of the lesbians that had not been in the women movement were there, and also we had the first women's cultural festival that weekend. By that time, a few people knew about the relationship with Joan and me, and I think it wasn't until the dance that there was any question about what it would mean, because that somehow it's different to have a dance for women that men couldn't come to than it had been to have meetings for women that men couldn't come to, for which we'd been having for quite a while. And in fact, that night was the first night that I know of in Washington that there was a scheduled meeting on lesbianism, which Joan and I attended. It was at GW, which was why we couldn't go to the meeting about the demonstration that had happened that day at the women's jail. Charlotte went to, who was the other woman who was living in our commune and who at the time chose to do that.